Hi friends, Jenny at Clover and Violet here, and today I'm going to be teaching you foundation paper piecing. Foundation paper piecing is great for projects that have unique angles, are very tiny, or you just want that excellent expert point. We're going to be using the heart block from my mini needle book pattern. You're going to print it just like this on paper, and then we'll be sewing all of our fabrics to the paper to make our finished quilt block. This quilt block can be then sewn into a variety of things like the mini needle book. So let's get started together and learn how to foundation paper piece. Let's get started with some foundation paper piecing. Today we're going to be making the little heart for the mini needle book, and this is what your finished heart is going to look like. I'm going to use the exact same fabrics on this heart that I have yet to sew so that you can see where everything goes and how this heart comes together. So we're going to need our paper pattern, which I've printed off from the last sheet of the needle book pattern. This pattern has 4 sections. Different paper piecing patterns can either have just one section, like the diamond piece from the mini needle book, which you can see right here. Here's the diamond piece. This is just one section. So you're just going to piece around following the numbers. Okay, but this heart pattern has 4 sections. These sections, since they're just really simple, I'm just going to add them as regular fabric without using this and just use this piece as my template. But in a different pattern, every additional section might be a full detailed piece. So you can see we're going to start with A, then move on to B, C, and D. And you're going to sew each of these individually and then sew them together. So we're going to start with piece A. And I'm using really generous sized fabric pieces for our foundation paper piecing, just because that will make it really easy for us for this video. You can definitely trim your pieces down, but you want to make sure that your piece, we're going to do A1, part of the heart, and before I get too far, I'm going to show you, you can see this heart, A1, actually ends up being on the left side. So your fabric is going to go on the back of this piece, right? So we're going to sew through these lines and we're going to place our fabric like this. All right, so this is going to be your sewing lines. And then when you're done, you're going to turn your piece over. And that's how that's going to move over to this side, okay? So you just need a piece. This is how you decide the size of your pieces. I like to just cut larger pieces and then trim them down rather than worrying I'm going to run out. But you can use more accurate sizes. You just need to be 1/4 inch beyond this gray portion. So I've just cut my piece A1 to fill this whole space, but you could easily not fill all of this space. You could trim it down just as long as you have 1/4 inch past where this is going to go. So I could have saved this little piece of fabric, but the closer your fabric is in exact shape to your piece, the more careful you're going to have to be with your sewing. So here we have our first A1 piece, and then we're going to take our this is going to be the edge of my heart, okay? And so we're going to look for piece A2, and I have a light here. I'm going to bring it down so that you can kind of see, but it's going to make this film, okay, it's going to make my film a little weird, but this way you can see that with this light, I can hold my piece up to the light and see through it really easy. So what I'm going to do with this A2 piece is place it right sides together, and then I'm going to use my light to line up my A2 edge about 1/4 inch from this line, okay? Can you see that? There's my piece. There it is through the light. All right, and so I'm gonna then just go and sew with my sewing machine on this line right here. And then these pieces, the right sides will open up, and when we turn it over, it'll be like this. Okay, so I'm gonna sew that, but I wanted you to see it. I usually hold it up to a window, sometimes even to the light on my sewing machine, but I'm gonna use this light. A light box would also be a great option. So you can kind of see the pink dots. Here is my piece. It's right sides together with my A1 piece. All right, let's take that to the sewing machine. All right, so here we are at the sewing machine, and here is your piece. You've got your two fabrics right sides together. We lined this up using our light just a second ago. You can't see it here because I'm shining a bright light so that you can see my sewing, but we've lined our piece up right sides together, and I'm just going to sew. I'm going to start at this dashed line. This is the perimeter of my block. I'm going to sew along this A2 line, and then I'm going to extend past it by 1/4 of an inch. And I like to extend past my seams because I feel like that keeps my fabric nice and straight, as long as you don't extend into some other piece. So it's usually always fine. I can't think of a situation where I've run into it being a problem, but that's just how I like to do it. And then the other thing I want to say is we're going to set our machine at 1.5 stitch length or something near that if your machine has numbered stitch length. So my machine only moves in 0.5 increments. So I've set mine at 1.5, and 2.5 is my common stitch length. If your machine has a dial with different stitch lengths, just choose the short one. That's going to really perforate our paper well and allow us to tear it out easily without pulling our stitches. So with my machine set at 1.5, I am going to just fix my stitches in place. My machine has an automatic stitch where it just stitches up and down 3 times. If you don't have something like that, just back stitch. So stitch forward a stitch, back stitch a stitch, and then forward another stitch. Again, that's just going to ensure that we don't accidentally rip out our stitches when we're doing our foundation piecing. So okay, so here's our stitching right along our line, and I've used this dark thread, and I'm a little off the line so that way you can really see where I'm sewing. So I'm going to fold this back, and I'll show you at the cutting table how we're going to trim this, and then we'll sew one more corner just so you're sure about how we sew through the paper. I've sewn this piece. You can see I've sewn on the line. I like to sew all the way to this dotted line. This dotted line is the edge of our block. My paper extends a little beyond it. So I've sewn on the line, and then I've sewn 1/4 inch past. And so when we turn this over, you can see how this is starting to make the corner of our heart block. So I'm going to turn it back. My pieces are right sides together. And I'm going to fold this along my sewn line. I'm going to take my small ruler, and this ruler has a nice 1/4 inch line here. I'm going to line this up with my fabric, and then I'm going to use my rotary cutter to trim off the excess. All right, so now I've trimmed this away, and then when I open it, I'm going to press right here. And so now, turn it back, and then I'm just going to trim again right past my block. I'm going to keep it nice and straight so that my piece stays square. All right, so here you can see one seam of my block coming together. You can press this with a seam roller or with your iron, and then we're just going to do the same thing again. So now I'm going to do corner A3. So again, I'm going to line my block up, get my light back here, and you can see kind of very faintly, you can see that line, it's 1/4 inch past the A3 line, and then I'm going to take it back to my sewing machine and sew that A3 line. Okay, so here's our first side, and then now we've got the same thing going on for our A3 corner. So I'm just going to again sew it. I'm going to start at the dashed line, fix it in place, and then just stitch following my line, and then I'm going to secure my stitch in place at the end when I've reached the other dashed line. And then that is my second piece right there. And so we're just going to keep doing that, sewing on all of these pieces. But I'm not going to show you every single sewing step because now you have a better understanding of what I mean when I'm talking about sewing on the paper to get your pieces perfect. So let's take this back to the cutting mat and we'll work on putting together the rest of the block. Okay, so here we've sewn our next corner. Again, you can see right sides together. We're gonna, from the back side, again fold this corner down. Now, when there's sewing past the edge, I'm just gonna carefully perforate my pattern to fold that down. So now you can see my stitching is here. My pattern piece is folded. Take my ruler again, line up my 1/4 inch line on the section I folded. Make sure you do this before you press your fabric open because otherwise you will cut your fabric off, which I have definitely done before. All right, so here's your corner, and then look, there is the point on our heart. So we're going to press this, and again, trim the point away, trim the excess. All right, and so now here's the top of our heart, all ready to go. This is going to get trimmed off in a minute. And now we're going to move on to A4, and we're just going to do this piece. This is how I measure. It's very scientific. Is this piece going to fit? Yes, it looks like it is going to extend 1/2 inch past my point, and it's going to be more than 1/4 inch so that I can sew it at 1/4 inch and fold it back. So I'm just going to do the same method, right sides together, line it up on my line right there, and then I'm going to sew on this A4 point. So let me take it over and sew it. And now I've sewn this A4 section. You can see it right here. It's going to flip down. We're just going to repeat the same thing again. Fold on our sewn line. Make sure our pieces are still right sides together. And use my 1/4 inch to trim this off. All right, and then we're going to press this open, and now you can see we have almost 1/2 of a heart here. So I'm going to press this really well. Okay, and then I'm going to use one of these vertical pieces. You can see I did fussy cut this so that they all go the same direction. So I have a vertical piece and a horizontal piece. I'm just going to take my scissors and snip this vertical piece in 1/2. All right. And then my heart is going this way. You can see here's my small point. So I'm going to turn this right sides over. And again, let me just grab my lamp, turn it on. And you can see, since this is a darker fabric, it makes it easier to see, but you can see how I'm lining up my fabric about 1/4 inch. Again, maybe a little more. And then I'm just going to sew along that line by the A5 between the A2, A1, A4, and that is going to make my side. So let's take that over and sew it. And again, I'm just sewing with my machine straight stitch. Okay, and now I've sewn on my long line. You can see all my extras here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to fold this back and just gently tear away from my stitching. Since I'm using a shorter stitch length, it really perforates the paper well and just allows me to tear the stitching lines out. And you can see here's my piece right sides together. I'm just going to line this up again and trim it. And then here is half of my heart. A lot of threads, half my heart. So I'm going to give this a nice press, and I'm just using my iron without steam. And then I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to trim to the dotted line. If you've enlarged or shrunk your pattern, you're going to want to just trim 1/4 inch from the black line right here. This is my dotted line is 1/4 inch from the black line because I have used my pattern to the correct scale. So then you're just going to trim, and I'm using a different rotary cutter. You can see here's my fabric cutter. This is my paper rotary cutter because cutting paper a lot will dull your blade. So I always switch over to an extra handle that I had that I put an old blade in. So I'm just going to trim right along this edge. Like so. The paper cutter doesn't cut fabric as well, so sometimes you have to go over those twice. Okay, and here we have our first half of a heart. So I am going to make the second half of the heart, which, as you'll remember, this is going to be the front and this is your back that you sew on. So when we look at it like this, and then when we turn it over, it's going to be like this. So I'm going to use my red dot and some more this pink and white and my blue to make the mirror image this other heart side. So I'm going to make that, and then I'll come back and show you how to sew these two papered pieces together. Okay, so now that I've sewn the second half of this heart, we have these two separate foundation pieces, all right? So if we turn them over, you can see based on this gray color, this is the portion that's going to show, and then this all the way around the edge is our seam allowance. So what we're going to do is actually join these two pieces, squaring them up the best that we can, and I'm going to sew right along this long seam, and when we open that, that will make our heart. So I'm going to sew through both of these pieces along the seam, and that's going to help me get my perfect points. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine, just sew along this seam, and then come right back to you. Alright, so you can see from my sewing, you can see my blue thread right along that seam line on both sides of this heart. So when we open it up, we have a really great match up on our points. And we can actually open this up, press it, and then sew our top and bottom borders. For this specific pattern that we're looking at, our top and bottom are just a single piece. So I'm actually not going to use these papers to sew it because it's just more paper. I would have to tear off a single piece. But if you were making a more complex block, there could be additional top and bottom pieces as well that you would want to sew to your bigger block, or side pieces. Just there's a variety of ways those can all be built out. So what I'm going to do is the next step I'm going to take before I press it and before I add my top pieces is I'm going to remove the portions that will be under the seam. Alright, so when we look at this from the back, if you were to press it open or to one side, there are going to be papers under these seams, right? And so then when I went to sew my top, I would really be sewing the papers in to these segments. So what I'm going to do is remove the side piece all the way, or by the side, I mean the seam allowance piece. And since I'm using my tighter stitch, these do punch out easier. Okay. Alright, so there's the seam allowance removed, and you can see how that pressed, but this piece, this the A3, the B2, and some of the corners are also, I'm going to take out because they would also go under that seam allowance, and that's just going to make it harder to remove. But I do like to leave some of the paper in to keep my piece nice and stiff and to help me match up my seams so that I get those perfect points. So I'm just going to tear this off. And then I'm just going to loosen this edge a little bit here, but leave it in place. The same with this one, because nothing is going to actually sew these pieces down. So I'll press this open. Then I'm going to turn it over. And then I've cut this long strip, slightly bigger than this C1 and D1 piece, and I'm just going to sew it right sides together to my top piece, but I'm going to use my line on the back as my seam allowance guide. I'm going to use my line on the back as my seam allowance guide right here to make sure that I get those 2 heart points as perfect points. So I'm leaving off this paper piece. You could use it if you wanted to piece something. That's an option. This is just there to help us cut the correct size of our piece. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine and sew this piece on, and I'll be right back. Okay, so now we've sewn on our top and bottom pieces. You can see my blue thread right along those lines, top and bottom. And then we're going to just open this up and press it, and you can see how this creates such perfect points for us. And that is really one of the best things about foundation piecing, is that you get perfect points, and it can allow you to create unique designs that would be very hard to piece traditionally. So the angles on these hearts, not hard to piece traditionally, but easy to get the perfect points here. And you can piece much more complicated shapes with much smaller pieces using foundation piecing. So I'm going to press these top and bottom. All right, and then I'm just going to trim them using my ruler to trim them to the same width as these sides. So in this particular case, I used 1-inch pieces, and so 3/4 inches is how large my pieces ended up after my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to trim, lining my 3/4 inch up along my foundation pieced side. Trim that, and then do that on the other side as well. All right, and then on my top and bottom piece, which I know are larger, I'm just going to again line up the 3/4 inch line with my seam and trim my top and bottom piece to size. And there we have our finished heart. Now, before you use this, you would want to go ahead and take out all the rest of these papers on the back. Until I'm actually ready for that step of my project, I generally leave my pieces on, and then I just remove them right before I sew, and that keeps everything nice and flat and crisp and easy to work with. So I hope that you enjoyed making this foundation paper pieced heart with me. I would love to see your finished needle books, or you could turn this into a cute pin cushion. There are just a lot of great options, and I look forward to seeing what you make. I would love for you also to subscribe to my newsletter, and I look forward to getting to know you better. Thanks for watching.